Hi, boys and girls. It's me, Butch. My name is Terry David Silvercloud. I'm not native, just sounds that way. I'm 79 years old. I'll be 80 this October. Today is the 19th of July, Friday, 2024. And because I'm old and I may be fit, I have serious health issues and I could drop dead at any moment in front of your very eyes. I'm making videos, and the videos I'm making, I'm trying to be useful by teaching you things and expressing my ideas in certain areas of physics, particle physics, motion physics, what you might call creation physics. There never was a creation, but for the sake of argument, we will talk about creation physics, and it's usually under the label Big Bang. Never was a Big Bang. There's no evidence of any kind of explosion, but there is evidence that celestial bodies seem to be moving apart and have been for some time, and somebody a long time ago in the 30s or somewhere did some calculations to when they might have been together, and up comes this Big Bang theory. I digress a lot, and I don't want to do that. So I'm a scientist at heart. I'm a photographer and an artist, but I had planned to get into physics when I was young, and my colorful life got in the way. But here I am with nothing better to do, and I think about reality. And at the end of the video, I'll talk a bit more about shapes. I think first of all, I want to talk about Socrates for a second, because I call this Socrates on the beach. Socrates was ordered to kill himself by his fellow citizens, primarily it seems because he was preaching to the young men with whom he was hanging out at the tavern outside of the market, the under 18-year-old men who he liked. Butch gets that. That there were no gods and the gods were all a bunch of hooey. And those kind of things don't go over well with the priests as people like Jesus. Jesus found that one out too. So they had a vote somehow or a trial, and Socrates was ordered to kill himself, and or they would do it for him. So he killed himself. So I'm godless, but unlike Socrates, I've got a ton of science behind me, and I can explain why the whole God thing is just silliness for uneducated people who don't think too deeply and can be easily ordered about. Manipulated. The religious are easily manipulated, and they are manipulated. Where am I going with all of this? So, for those that need to have a God, for Butch, my scientific definition, because I have to have some sort of definition for God, is that God is a metaphor for the sum of all reality, all at once, all of the time. Always was, always will be. It's not a thing. It's like Mother Nature. It just is. You're God, I'm God, everything's God. 7 billion people on the planet, so God's having 7 billion human experiences per second as I speak. 2 babies are being born every second, so God's having at least 2 orgasms a second. And God's being tortured to death in, the strip, Gaza there. God has to experience all the horrors and pleasures all at once, all the time. That's God. You're God. Have fun with it. Butch fully expects that when he's dead, that will be the end of this God experience. I scientifically can't see any other reason why it would be otherwise. Where am I going with all this? So I'm Socrates on the beach, and the God-fearing always say, well, God created reality, but then they forget they have to explain where God came from, and that gets really dicey too. So we got to get rid of God, no gods, and we have to go back to what created God, I guess. So what created God? The original, everything all at once, everywhere. So Butchie Poo says that there were no Big Bang, but for the sake of science, we have to look at reality as being infinite, and it is. It just goes on and on and on, sort of like irrational numbers, and that's important to remember, by the way. And it's filled with one substance, and one of the characteristics of the substance is it must occupy space. This is Butch's. There are no rules in the science books that are going to teach you this. This is Butch's idea. But if you're a scientist, you listen to other science types. You want to know. Science means knowing. Scientists explore knowledge and they want to know. So if you're really curious, you'll listen to what I have to say, and you'll either say, well, he's full of shit, or you'll say, he might be onto something there. I don't differ very much from current scientific thought. In terms of theory, I'll tell you right up front, my big disagreement is all about gravity. In all the various little iffy nooks and crannies of physics, gravity is an attraction force, a very, very weak one. Nevertheless, it's there. And those who are observant will notice that most of what we would think of gravity, like your weight for one, is not caused very much at all by that attraction of matter. It's caused by the fact that as I'm talking to you, we are whirling through space. Right now, we are whirling through space with the Milky Way at approximately 230,000 kilometers per second. And the Milky Way is probably zipping along at that same speed itself. So the point I'm trying to make is all of this extraordinarily fast motion is being resolved down through the solar system by the sun going sort of mostly south pole forward in a little wiggle, and us circling around it. And we make in 1 year one gigantic wiggly helical wave, 7 billion kilometers long. So the wavelength of planet Earth within the within the solar system at least, no, within the Milky Way, within the Milky Way is 7 billion kilometers. And all of those forces are resolved by the Earth spinning, and eventually you're being pushed down into the Earth. The center of the Earth is right between your feet there, right between your legs, pointing straight down. That's the center of the Earth for you. And for me, it's over here. That's called relativity. That's something else I'm not going to talk about. I might talk about relativity, but the thing is, it's physical force that is what most of what you think is gravity. The rest is the weak force. And Butch says that weak force is push, not pull. As for the motion forces, Butch agrees entirely with the motion forces. So the only disagreement Butchie Poo has is that the weak gravitational force is push, not pull. And I shall explain why. So we got to get back to infinity is filled with something, and one of its chief characteristics is it must have its own space. Now in quantum physics, they just use a point source, and Schrodinger gave a standing point source its own wave equation. So in quantum physics, they have something along that line, but it has no size until you give it some energy. What I'm going to do is tell you the energy comes from the fact that it must have space. And in a way, we can sort of measure it, because being the smallest thing, it must set the speed of light. It just has to. I'll get back to that, I think. But it must occupy space, and we could figure it as, if space is infinity long, then the smallest unit of space will be just slightly above zero, which will be 1 over infinity. So that thing must either have a diameter or a surface area of 1 over infinity. The point is it has space, and it's saying, give me room, I want room. You up there, give me room. You down there, give me room. And it must, and it does, because why? Because it's here. There it is. Except it managed to work things up a bit, since that tiniest of 1 over infinity size of the smallest of the smallest of the small, I'm going to call it a quantum. The quantum might end up being a larger unit of energy. I'm not certain yet. But for argument's sake, because it works out fairly well most of the time, we'll just call it one quantum of something. And when it's sitting still, it has no spin of any sort. It's just sitting there, and all the other ones are sitting around it, back to back, top to each, forever, in all directions, each one of them touching each other. What's interesting about that is if one of them could move, every other one that's touching it must also move, and it will transmit any energy it has outwards because it's touching all the balls around it. But I also want you to notice there's a whole bunch of space in the middle there, isn't there? Gee, there's 30 balls in this box. If we could cube up the universe, this isn't a cube, but it was easy for me to buy a box like this. Pretend it's a cube. I know it's not a cube. But here we have 30 balls neatly cubed up, all back to each, top to bottom, and there's space left over. Quantum physics, they sort of ignore that. It ain't there. Well, that's no good. Relativity, well, they didn't think about that. Einstein, when he was first working on relativity, waves were all new, so he had to sort of work that in with special relativity and stuff like that later on and work in the waves. And Einstein wanted to make space curve with time. And sometimes you can get away with that in the thinking. But I think one of the explanations were that space-time are curved, light should bend towards stars, and you could even possibly catch a glimpse of a star even after it just slightly gone behind another object. The point is the light was going bendy around something solid. It was going around the corner. Or it was bending. Well, that should happen because the sun is basically, because gravity is push, which says so, not pull, all that space crap is being literally pushed into the sun, where it's all gobbled up and spit out in all kinds of ways, and some of it comes spewing out at the poles as matter that's below subatomic. And the point of it all is the area around the sun for millions of miles out, and this is fact, this is not Butch stuff, this is real fact, it's full of all kinds of crap. And that means it's denser, and it's the nature of electronic waves, of any waves basically, physical or electronic, to bend towards the denser medium. Did I get that right? Yeah, to bend towards the denser medium. And it depends on the wavelengths that are hitting it. You know, longer waves will react one way and shorter waves will react another way. The point I'm trying to make is we haven't really proved Einstein on that particular point because space is denser around stars. And when the sun is physically rotating and has a north and south pole, the area, just like Saturn has rings around the equator area, will be much denser than at the poles. So light will bend differently towards the sun at the equator than it will at the poles. All kinds of strange things going on out there. I'm just keep rambling. If you want to learn stuff, just hang in there. So where was I going with all this? So what Butch wants to tell you is that these individual smallest possible units in quantum physics will just be the equation for a wave that's just sitting there, but it won't account for the area around it until it gets some energy and starts doing something. So that isn't going to really work for reality. So why the space? Why do we need the space? Like, why a ball? A ball is one surface, technically. It is. It's basically one surface, and if we gave the surface area 1 over infinity square, whatever units you choose, that would be about as small as you're going to get, because the next thing is you ain't there. You're nothingness. If the diameter were 1 over infinity, then we'd have to deal with the circumference and all of that. And you could go with that route if you want. It doesn't really matter. It's to get into your head that the smallest of the small must have its own space, and it is pushing, and it's pushing everywhere. Now, the other thing is these balls, aside, like if one of them decides to rotate in any particular way, every other ball that's touching it will have to respond and rotate with it at its speed, which will be its circumference. It's kind of handy. That's, I think, where Einstein got the E equals mc squared thing, because we're looking at the, circumference of a circle, where the radius is the speed of light. So I think that's where he was going, and that's a pretty cool idea, because that thing is setting the speed of light. Now, if these things are just sitting there and doing nothing, you say, well, how are they setting the speed of light? They would set it if some energy were to enter them, and they would have to respond. And by rotating a half spin, that's a physical spin, not a quantum spin. Please, kids, do not confuse quantum spin with physical spin. This is Butch physical spin at that level, which may by coincidence be quantum spin, but it would only be a half spin. In this case, it's not useful because we need a whole spin. But if it rotated a whole spin, this thing would indeed be an object, like an electron, which would have a whole spin quantum-wise. I don't want to stray into quantum physics because I don't want to confuse you. It confuses enough of me. I don't want to confuse you. I want this to be like a whole thought process where Butch just rambles and get your mind to thinking about how you can create the universe with one substance, and all it has to do is occupy its own space, and it touches every single other one of its type to infinity, forever. But we know it doesn't, because there's been some breakdowns. So what happens is the space in between here, if these things set the speed of light, this space in between here will end up being at less than the speed of light. And that's like the corner of the room of your house. It collects the dust bunnies. So if there was any way any little bits of crap could build up on this thing by getting a little bit bigger, a little bit fatter, occupying a little more space, but then it got rubbed off, that crap would end up in these in-between spaces, and it would have to exist at less than the speed of light. And it would probably form those wonderful things that the string theorists want, which are called strings. Other people who are into membrane theory would say, oh, good, we figured out how to get membranes. Maybe they already figured it out, I don't know. But the point is, the in-between space has to occupy less speed, if anything happens, than the balls themselves. The balls are fixed by their own size. They can physically spin faster, but they can't get bigger. If they could get bigger, then they would start squeezing the rest of the universe out from them. And perhaps that's exactly what happens, except where would it get the material? Well, it could borrow the material from the space in between, maybe. The point I'm trying to get to is that there never was a time when this actually happened. But if you wrap your mind around it, you can see how you can create an entire universe of at least one type of something from one thing, as long as it has the ability to occupy space, and there's enough of them to be infinite. If they aren't infinite, that would actually be very interesting, but if you want a stable universe, they got to be infinite. And so where Butch is stepping into liking real physics, Butch says that these little things are the Higgs bosons. I said I was going to call it a quantum. It's a quantum, but it's also a Higgs boson. And what it is it's the somethingness that can't quite be somethingness and wants to be. So it's creating the field around it just by being itself. And that crap will start to appear in the in-between spaces. And ironically, it will also be spherical. Weird, huh? But that's the way it has to be, because it can have only one surface, because it has to have only oneness, but not nothingness. Nothingness is nothingness. 1 over infinity is not nothingness either. For instance, if the diameter of these things is 1 over infinity, if the circumference is 1 over infinity, then the diameter must be even smaller. It would probably have to be zero 0.5 over infinity. So you can get smaller and smaller to the point where you are at decimal 0.000000000000000000000000000. You got the idea? 1 over infinity. It's really small. It's possible. It's just possible. You got to wrap your mind around it, but it wants space. So it creates it by being the first cause, the pressure that gets everything stirring. And then once it gets stirring, these balls could join as a group of larger balls. These could be I know it's in a cube shape right now, but it could be a sphere of balls. That's where I like the flower of life diagrams, and I'll pop somehow into the video here a sculpture of a sphere engraved with the flower of life. And you'll get the idea, because it's circles intertwining circles, which are the balls intertwining other balls, because they're really just energy from our point of view. They're invisible, way too small to see. I mean, they're not even remotely close to light wavelength, so they're invisible, and we just see straight through them. Can't be a solid, because solids require more structure than would a liquid or a gas, and even a liquid would require more structure. So we want the most structure-free whatever we could have there is, and it's a gas. And in this case, a special type of gas, and we could call it plasma, I guess. That might work. But it has gaseous qualities and very, very small size. So if you divide the universe up into cubes, and I've told you that it's nothing but a bunch of balls, really, of energy pushing out. The reason I'm calling them balls is the balls can be centered at the center and push out in all directions equally all at once. When you start cubing and dicing up the universe with straight lines, you run into a problem, because the sphere could touch the inner side of the cube, or the sphere could touch the corners of the cube, and which is which. So it ends up being a bit of both, because the force is being pushed out every direction all at once from the center. It's an irrational number. It's infinite. It's pushing in every direction all at once all of the time, just like God. It's just like God. It's pushing in all directions all at once all of the time, equally. And we know from laws of physics that every force has an equal and opposite force. So the universe is pushing back with all its might to crush it out of existence. And you might say, well, if you've got a universe that's infinitely big, why can it not crush that little sucker out of existence? The reason it can't is it's so small. It probably has a surface of 1 over infinity. It's basically nothing. And so the surface force that the universe is able to push upon it is 1 over infinity, that's not too bad. It's kind of how your body works. The reason you don't implode is that your body has a way of dissolving gases in your bloodstream to keep your internal pressure equal to the external pressure around you. That only screws up when people go diving deep underwater or climbing up mountains or falling out of airplanes. And then they either explode or implode, one or the other, unless they have proper gear. You getting the drift? I think I've probably talked a long time now, and I don't really care, because I'm going to be doing a bunch of these, and I'll probably repeat myself a lot. And it's really for you serious geeks out there. Now, I got into all this by examining ancient shapes and things like the Kaaba and the Holy of Holies and noticing that they were cubes, and origami, where I discovered, like with certain shapes, basically based around the square root of 2, you can take just about anything. And believe it or not, this is a cube all folded up. If I were to fold this all the right way back together, it's a cube, but you can see it's really just little bits of shapes, in this case squares, and they're folded in the middle. And the reason I'm doing that is that for those of you who like strings, those little bits between the balls would become the strings, and they would gain physical spin, not quantum spin, physical spin, and they would be inclined to line up head to toe with other ones that were spinning as they were. And you can choose to spin this way, or you can choose to spin that way. So the girls spin to the right and the boys spin to the left. And because they were spinning, there would be energy. They're still spinning, so there's energy entering one end and out the other for both of them. And if they line themselves up, come saw, like to line them up, to each other like that, each is spinning the way it wants. If this one is spinning in through the cracks and this is spinning into the cracks, they're basically stuck together. So this would be essentially what a hydrogen molecule would look like, and each one would be a hydrogen atom. One would be a right spinning physically, and one would be a left spinning physically, not quantum physically. If it coincided, that's just a coincidence. And they would be inclined to join up, and the electron would be somewhere in here, stuck in the middle, and it would be a right. If this is right spinning, the electron would be physically right spinning, and the electron over here. They would probably not necessarily be in there, but position themselves out to create a shape, and you could end up with odd. That's how you end up getting. Oops. If you have a string and it can fold, but it's got a field in between, all kinds of weird things can happen, and you could have all these things start joining up together. And one of the basic shapes which can tile space is a regular prism, which means all the sides are equal. Each one is 1. Which conveniently creates triangles. So it's possible to create equilateral triangles using equal size sticks, which you can call strings if it makes you feel better. I'm just throwing all these ideas into your head, so if you haven't thought about them before, now you're going to say, I don't know what he's on about, but it's a bit weird and it could be interesting. So another thing you can do, let me reach down here between the rocks. Ouch. Oh, that's my cube. We'll put that cube over there. And I want you to realize your cubes can be with sides of square root of 2, which makes the diagonal of 1, or vice versa. And you can come up with joining things up in weird shapes, which I've been doing, and that's what you're seeing here. So this is 1/2 of a gyrobifastigium. It's a regular prism. A gyrobifastigium is a Johnson solid. Here's one that's all painted green. And you can see, I don't know if you can see, it's one of those, and then another one upside down. Oops, can you hear me? It's another one upside down, rotated at 90 degrees. So what you get, put you down there. Where are you? There's one. So a gyrobifastigium. This is a gyrobifastigium, which is really just two regular prisms. This can fill the universe, and the regular prism can fill the universe. Now, what's really interesting, if you take the two regular prisms and you put them side by each, comme ça, you have a rhombic cube. This rhombic cube has exactly the same volume as if it was a cube standing up. And that means each one of these little suckers here has 1/2 of the volume. And you can see if you started with a cube, or if you started with cubing the universe and it had a ball trapped inside, pushing on the sides of its cage, each side of its cage, how it might distort the cube of time-space, of the space in between. There's a whole lot of ways in which motion could get going, even if you isolate everything down to one little sucker that is a surface area of 1 over infinity, or even if it's got a surface area over a decimal 0.00000, you get the idea. So it's so small. The universe is fractal, and it may be that there's nothingness, might be a kind of an illusion, but for all practical purposes, there's a point at which you guys say, I think I got enough of this. All right, have I covered anything I wanted to cover? If you start chopping up a cube, and you chop off the corners, you'll get an interesting Archimedean solid, which can be popped into all kinds of shapes. Also, if you were to, oops. If you were to draw an X, oops, gotta get my microphone down there. I'm trying to see where I'm looking here. If you were to draw an X, can you see that? On a surface of a cube and start chopping it up, you'd say, well, what's going on inside there? And what's going on inside there is a three-dimensional Star of David, sometimes called the Merkaba star. And then if you chop the pointy things off, you get that octahedrally funny shaped thing I was just showing you. All of that is what got me trying to figure out, well, how do you make a universe? Because the problem is irrational numbers and spheres. But spheres are actually the solution to the problem, because the spheres are natural-born gears, and they can transmit energy just by rotating themselves to their buddy, anyone that's touching them anywhere. And so what it comes down to is that the original stuff can't really be a cube unless it was a cube that could shift shape to exactly the same volume as a sphere, which is possible. So if you took that sphere that was inside the cube and made it be puffed it up, so filled up some more, so it was exactly the same volume as that cube, and then gave the cube loosey-goosey edges, so it became a sphere. Now you've got yourselves a power center with wobbly surface, and it would extend in your cube universe to the corners of the cube. You'd say, well, that's pretty good. Well, unfortunately it's not, because you end up pushing harder even on the neighboring cubes. Oh, wait a minute, that's good. There's more force. Gee, I like that. The other thing is that the cube will start seeking other shapes. And if the cube shrinks from a cube shape to a regular rhomboid, that's basically two regular prisms back to each was exactly the same proportions as a gyro bifastigium of the same size. There's a number of ways you can shift that volume around in shape and have edges and sides. Butch says that solids have pointy parts and flat surfaces, that liquids tend to take the shape of a somebody's coming with music, which gets me afraid of copyright. That would I'm losing track of what I'm talking about. Shoot, I lost track of what I was talking about. You have to be able to change your sphere into different shapes. So I've gone on and on and on and on. I had so many things I wanted to talk about. Let's just for a second, before I pop out of here, pull this sucker out here. This is a cube, and to give you the point I'm trying to make, is the volume will not always be the same if you start twisting it. Certainly the volume is not going to be much there, but if you turn it into a perfect rhomboid cube, the volume will be exactly the same. All right, I've gone on and on and on. Gee, I go on and on. Anything else I can show you? Origami is something else you want to think about, and fractals. These are the same, taking the same cube or string, 4 strings, folding them. There's all kinds of wonderful things you can do with them. All right. I think that's it. So Butchie Poo is going to say goodbye for this evening down here at English Bay, the 19th of July, 2024. Socrates at the beach. I'm just talking about my theory of everything, really, and why the whole idea of gods is just plain silly. It's a mind control game for ignorant people. Ignorance means you don't know anything. Science is knowledge. Scientists are people who seek and practice knowledge. The word science comes from knowing, the word knowing, an old Latin word or a related Latin word. So if you're ignorant, it just means you don't know anything that you should know. All of us don't know what we don't know. I don't know what I don't know. But if you're a scientist, you'll want to explore my ideas as well as those of others. And Butchie Poo is going to go around to the back of the camera and say, bye-bye, but I got to creep up behind you here. Got to switch to my soft voice. My soft bedroom voice. Butchie Poo is going to say, good night, dear.